Check, check, 1, 2. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Commission on Connecticut's Development and Future regular meeting, April 3rd. We do have the attendance roster here that our clerk is going through for those that are on Zoom and those that are in the chambers here. So with that, we will move on to the approval of the March 6, 2023 minutes. And just looking to see. I don't see Tim Hollister on. Is he on? Okay. Tim, did you have a modification that you wanted to make to the minutes?
After reflection, no, I was concerned that the minutes did not capture the majesty with which I spoke, but never mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. In that case, could I get a motion to accept the minutes of March 6th?
So moved.
Thank you. It's been moved. Is there a second? And seconded? Is there any discussion? All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Is there any opposed? Okay, and seeing none, then we will accept the vote of the minutes by voice vote. Thank you. Continuing on our working group presentations, we've gone through 3 of the 5 presentations already. Today we will be hearing from the State Consolidated Housing Plan Group, and then next month will be on sewerage. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Kylie Goslin for the State Consolidated Housing Plan. I know she has a PowerPoint as well that our staff will do, and all of that will be posted after our meeting as well. So Kylie.
Thanks, Martin. I appreciate that. And thank you all of you on the commission for listening into a presentation that I don't know will exceed the majesty of Tim Hollister's presentation at the last meeting, but I'll do my best. So I am one of the co-chairs of the subcommittee of the State Consolidated Housing Plan work group. I just want to take a moment to posthumously acknowledge my co-chair, the late and wonderful Representative Quentin Williams, who assisted in this group in putting this report together. In fact, one of the last communications that I had with Q right before the holidays was how he was was that he was really pleased with where this work had come and how this work had come together, of the report and the way that the group had worked together. So I wanted to just acknowledge that and again, thank him for his contributions and for the spirit with which he worked with this group, as he always did, with an eye towards housing justice. With that, I'll dive into the report, which you have. I will hit the highlights as Tim sort of did last week. I think it's important to just acknowledge first what the consolidated plan itself is. Next slide. So I'm going to, and here you see the list of members. Next slide. Next slide. We had a great group of folks, I'll say, from really across the state, representatives from the state government, as well as a couple of folks from COGS and some local planning and zoning officials, as well as just concerned citizens. A diverse group of opinions, I'll note too, that made up this group. And the majority of them really stuck with the process. So I'm grateful for that. And again, just a wide variety of opinions and viewpoints that were discussed throughout this process. This is the group charge per the legislation, and it really was to look at both the implementation of the plan and any potential statutory changes that the state could make towards the consolidated plan. And again, it's process that's all captured under 8-37T, which I'll get to shortly. Next slide. So I thought it would be good to start just briefly by telling folks what the consolidated housing plan is and what it isn't, how the Department of Housing currently goes about creating the consolidated plans. You have just a basic framework for that, as well as what are the other existing state housing planning documents and processes that currently exist here in the state of Connecticut. And then I'll just talk briefly about what our group reviewed in the course of our proceedings and how we educated ourselves as we moved through this process. Next slide. So the consolidated plan is a document that is required by HUD that the state produce every 5 years. And really what it does is lay out requirements or planning guidelines for how the state plans to use several buckets, if you will, of HUD funding. And that includes Community Development Block Grant, otherwise known as CDBG Small Cities, CDBG Recovery Housing Program, Home Investment Partnership Program, ESG or Emergency Solutions Grant Funding, HOPWA, also known as Housing Opportunities for Persons with AIDS, and the National Housing Trust Program or NHTF. This plan is submitted to the Department of Housing and Urban Development for review every 5 years. And it really has to describe sort of the methods for intended distribution of state resources to address housing and community development needs of extremely low and moderate income households, as well as persons experiencing homelessness here in the state. So Connecticut General Statutes 8-37T just simply codifies the federal plan requirement in state law and requires the commissioner of the Department of Housing to work with CHAFA in producing the consolidated plan. Next slide. And this is the regulatory framework. This slide actually came from Michael Santoro at the Department of Housing, who did a multi-meeting presentation with our work group on the consolidated plan and how the Department of Housing goes about putting that together. There's lots of different things that go into the consolidated plan. Again, this is all prescribed by HUD. So the consolidated plan is really a federal document or federal planning document that the state produces, again, dictating how it's spending these 5 buckets, or 6 if you want to include the multiple CDBGs of federal housing funding. Needs assessments go into this, some market analysis. There is a public participation program or role that is part of this. And these also build into the CAPER, which we'll talk about later. There's, again, multiple different planning documents, but this consolidated plan regulatory framework is sort of the buckets that go into the consolidated plan as it currently exists. Next slide. And what you see here on the slide is sort of how DOH administers the process, how it sets priorities and determines resources, goal setting, including citizen participation. And DOH has a timeline for how this process ensues, and it really is a process that begins early. So the planning processes already begin for the next plan once you finish the last one, kind of thing. There is an evaluation component of it, and we'll get into that shortly as well. Next slide. There's some other state housing planning processes and documents that exist outside of the consolidated housing plan. Again, the con plan, which I'll refer to it for this purposes of this presentation, is constricted in the buckets that it specifically addresses. So there are other sort of policy documents and planning documents that the state of Connecticut produces that address other components of our affordable housing financing scheme, if you will. So one is the qualified allocation plan. You may have heard of this as the QAP. This is a document that that CHAFA puts out every 2 years now that allocates points under the low-income housing tax credit federal funding scheme, and then projects are evaluated based on that point system. It is a policy document in many ways, as it outlines the priorities for how the state wants to allocate those tax credit dollars. CHAFA also produces its own strategic plan. That's a every 3-year process. Again, that's separate from the con plan and separate from the QAP. And then there also used to be a state long-range housing plan, which no longer exists, but was a document that was a broader housing planning document. We did review the last one of those as part of this process, but it's not something that continues to be a planning document at this time. Next slide. Here's a list of some of the things that the group reviewed as part of our process. Again, as I mentioned, DOH came to our meetings and went through the con plan process. We all reviewed the consolidated plan itself, which is just over some 300 pages. We had monthly meetings from March 2022 through the end of December, with some additional edits occurring in January and February of this year. We reviewed the relevant statutes, as noted here, both federal and state. There's also a statute 37U, Connecticut General Statutes, which ties the CHAFA annual plan and the con plan together. We reviewed that, the QAP, the old long-range housing plan. And then we also had some assistance from both law students as well as others who are part of this process, and looking at some best practices from other states too. Next slide. So now we'll walk through our final recommendations. And I'll start with sort of the overarching thing, which I think is the most important sort of goal that we came to in going through this process. And as you know, with the last couple of slides I've shown, there's several different planning documents. There's several HUD planning processes that occur. There's CHAFA housing planning documents. There's older documents. There's also different processes by which we evaluate the different housing finance programs and whether they're successful or not along different metrics, some of those state funded, some of those federal funded, some of those local funded. But there's no one real document, that sort of overarching plan that says this is really the direction the state needs to go with our housing planning. This is sort of the main goals that we have, and then look at all those different funding streams and say, these are how these different funding elements or different types of development can fit in that overall plan. And so really what the group came to the conclusion was that, you know, beyond the con plan, there needs to be a broader, more comprehensive guiding state housing policy doctrine that applies to all housing and community development funding, state, federal, and, as it should say here, and local in some cases. And such guidance should include more specific location-based elements. The group also felt there should be more clear, actionable steps for implementing this guidance, and those actionable steps apply not only to state government, but as a signal to developers and others about where the state wants to see development happen and where there's going to be more support, again, fiscal where possible, of that type of development. Measurable goals based on needs assessments, and I'll get to needs assessments and what those are in a moment. And a regular plan for assessing progress on those goals. The group felt strongly that we needed to not only set measurable goals and action steps, but also be very honest with ourselves about where every 5 years the state was succeeding in meeting those target goals, or where we were moving along in accordance with our own guidelines or proposals, and where we are diverging from those, and really look at why. Where are we succeeding? Where are we not? And what are the causes for those? Are they market driven? Are there other funding elements that are hindering progress, so that the next plan can take that into account? Next slide. And then I say the third point of these overarching goals, the group recognized that much of what we're requesting here, particularly things like additional needs assessments and a broader state housing planning doctrine, whether that comes out of the Department of Housing or OPM or other state agency, does require some additional funding. That the requirements or the requests that this group feels were necessary in order to get to a more comprehensive planning approach to housing in the state would require some additional permanent staff capacity over time. And so we felt that it would be remiss not to note that if we're going to put forth recommendations, we also have to recognize where it will require additional resources on the part of the state. Next slide. So I'll walk through the 7 elements within a broad housing planning doctrine that the group felt would be valuable to include. And I'll just start by noting that some of these elements are included in the con plan, or they're included in some of the other doctrines I mentioned, or processes, planning processes, but they may not be as robust as the group thought would be helpful, or again, they're scattered in different documents rather than being aligned in one process. So the first is to require a state housing needs assessment every 5 years and incorporate the findings of that. This would be a more in-depth housing needs assessment than what we currently have seen. Recent housing needs assessment have been performed by both state government as well as some outside organizations like the Urban Institute. And typically they incorporate things like census data, housing data, and other market indicators. The group felt that particular attention should be paid to racial and income segregation. The plan should track these and other metrics from year to year and identify trends and successes. And that it would also be important to note things like where there are more or less affordable homeownership opportunities, vacancy rates, building code violations, if possible, to track housing quality issues, where resident turnover and neighborhood experience data can be incorporated, that should also be a part. Percentage of households eligible for using subsidies versus those who actually receive them, and voucher utilization rates, including the time it takes voucher recipients to find housing when they can use a voucher. The actual report goes into some more details around incorporating things like the existing opportunity maps, and other different assessment elements, housing cost burden, things like that, that could be incorporated in this needs assessment to really get a full picture every year as this broader planning doctrine or consolidated housing plan is being put forth, of where we are failing and where we are succeeding to meet the needs of low and moderate income residents here in the state of Connecticut. Next slide. The next one goes back to the idea of aligning other types of planning documents and also expanding evaluation of prior performance. So the current past performance section of the consolidated plan discusses the 5 federal program it administers. That's its job. But we recommend that the plan expand the past performance section to include a detailed evaluation of performance on affordable housing goals, actions, and metrics identified in the strategic plan section here of our report. And should also include an evaluation of expenditures of state housing funding and whether these and the federal expenditures advance the goals and metrics that were set out in the plan and ultimately reduced housing insecurity in Connecticut, which is what these funding streams are designed to do. And then many other states incorporate other HUD required plans like AAP, annual action plans, or CAPER, also known as the Consolidated Annual Performance and Evaluation Reports, and DOH could do the same. National best practice does often bridge these together. There are different processes to do that we've outlined in the report. Next slide. The third element is to tailor plan to communities. We talk a lot in the state about how we have 169 towns and they're all different and everyone's got different housing and different housing needs. Different infrastructure and all that's true. And so the group felt it was important to note that as any plan is being put together, it's a consolidated housing plan or a broader housing planning doctrine, that it take into account different elements of the individual communities. That includes racial, ethnic, and economic segregation, concentrations of existing affordable housing, historic success or failure to permit or facilitate affordable housing development, local fiscal capacity, including factors like mill rates, grand lists, availability of other flexible municipal resources like local housing funds, the current opportunity map, mobility opportunities for increasing homeownership, and the potential for new transit options are a few that we named here as items that should be considered as the state is looking to plan housing in a way that meets the needs of low and moderate income residents. Next slide. The next is to identify opportunities and incentives for rehab and preservation. So rehab and preservation can be a great way to work within existing housing stock and existing infrastructure to meet affordable housing needs. So where certain funding streams like home, for example, can be used for rehabilitation and preservation, the plan could identify types of locations and housing types ideal for such projects and identify those types of projects as priorities in certain communities. And additionally, we note that the plan should incorporate preservation targets for those existing deed restricted units reaching the end of their affordability term. So as many of you know, oftentimes units that are deed restricted or project-based Section 8, those types of things have a shelf life or a certain timeline at which they have to remain affordable. And as units reach the end of that affordability period, they may or may not turn over to market rate housing. So a planning doctrine should really track that. Where are we as a state with our existing housing stock? It's one thing to create new housing stock, which is needed. But if we're losing just as many deed restricted units each year as we're creating, then we're not really moving the ball. So identifying where preservation, which markets preservation makes sense in, where preservation should be a focus, and what resources can be used for that is something that would be ideal in the con plan again, or a larger planning doctrine. Next slide. Housing quality and healthy homes was another element the group felt was important to include in a broader housing planning doctrine. I don't have to share with all of you. We have older housing stock. Much of it is in disrepair. There are certain funding streams that can be used to rehabilitate that and or turn that into affordable housing. But noting where many privately owned multifamily homes require upgrades and improvements, where low rents and housing values result in little to no support from private financing. Government funding may be necessary in many of these cases to ensure that our existing housing stock, be it deed restricted or not, but it's meeting the needs of low and moderate income households, should be addressed and should be part of a broader planning doctrine, given the age of Connecticut's housing stock. Next slide. The next is to identify non-funding housing strategies in alignment with outside actors and plans. So this suggests that the consolidated plan or broader housing doctrine should go beyond funding implementation goals and be a better vehicle for housing planning more broadly in the state. And this includes taking into account things like other actors in the space that may be playing a role in housing development, but which are not directly funding that development. That includes COGS, CDFIs, philanthropic foundations, private developers, public housing authorities in some cases. In many ways, they operate independently from one another or in small groups driven by the varied sort of funding mechanisms and priorities of a multitude of different programs. But creating a strategic state plan for housing action that incorporates these varied resources and different actors and attempts to create a more unified, organized, goal-oriented direction for that spending and those actors will better help Connecticut achieve its housing goals. This section goes into more details on things like making recommendations for non-funding housing strategies such as upzoning, other zoning considerations, things like that impact our ability to create housing and can direct where we create housing, but don't necessarily require funding in order to implement, and therefore wouldn't currently be considered as part of a consolidated housing plan. Next slide. And finally, the group wanted to make a note to incorporate input from people with lived expertise. And we'll note that the current consolidated plan process includes open participation elements and input from lots of the nonprofits and other groups that work in the space. And so anybody is free to participate and offer comments on that process. And the group felt it would be more important to actually intentionally include input from persons with lived expertise of homelessness and housing insecurity, particularly folks that are either in housing that was built with some of the funding that we're talking about, or perhaps our voucher holders or in other ways touch the system. Those folks have a unique and very valuable perspective on how and where our funding intentions are succeeding and where they're failing, and oftentimes have very good and detailed recommendations on how we can do better in implementing those funding streams. And so we've made some recommendations in here and how to do that, ensuring that those participants be compensated for their time and expertise. But again, that input be intentionally sought and intentionally incorporated as part of this program, rather than left to sort of the public participation process. So with that, I'll conclude by just saying, I think, again, the main point that the group wanted to make in putting the report together is to say the consolidated housing plan is a finite document. It, again, controls a set amount of federal funding streams and is prescribed in terms of what it must include and must not include, but that there's a need to go beyond that and to also incorporate some of the other planning documents and housing policy documents that are kind of being created and floating around, if you will, in our state space, but perhaps aren't being aligned with one another, and that being more intentional about how we approach housing planning and perhaps creating one document that meets the needs of what HUD is requiring, but also meets broader needs for our state funding and our state intentions as it ties to our housing production is really important. So those 7 elements are things that the group felt should be incorporated either as part of the consolidated plan, but more appropriately as part of a broader, more comprehensive and intentional planning process here in the state. So I'm happy to answer any questions folks may have. But that's it for us. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Kylie. And if just a reminder for those that are on remotely to just use the raised hand feature, and that we can call on you. Tim Hollister.
Thank you. Kylie, thank you for the report. Here's my question. Is the theme of the report that overall the con plan process currently works reasonably well and we just have to tweak it? Or is the report more in the nature of a call that there are some serious systemic problems that need more of an overhaul? I was struck by the depth of and seriousness of the recommendations, but I just couldn't tell sort of what the tone of the recommendations was in that vein.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I think there's probably some mixed feelings on that. I think the consolidated plan, as it's produced, meets the needs of what HUD is requiring of the state, but those are, as I noted, very prescribed requirements. So I think there are many on the group that felt, hey, the needs assessment that we're doing that's part of this consolidated housing plan could be a much more full-bodied needs assessment that would provide us with information that could be helpful to the state beyond what's just needed for the consolidated plan. So I don't think it was a sense that the Department of Housing is failing on its job to produce the consolidated housing plan. I think it's that wasn't the case at all. We're doing what's required of us as a state in producing the consolidated plan, but more that just doing that isn't enough. That the consolidated plan provides either a jumping off point or a basis from which to do something that is much more comprehensive and much more thoughtful and much more detail focused. So using that needs assessment, for example, really looking at a lot of other different elements, usage, need, housing cost burden. Some of those things are incorporated currently, but really going further and looking at how we can do better with the resources we have, but what are the needs? Knowing those needs change regularly. The group even contemplated whether it made sense to do sort of an interim needs assessment, as we've seen the market has shifted drastically. So I think folks generally agreed that the plan meets what's required of it, but that it provides an opportunity to do something more. And that's what we were really, that's, I think, the aim of the report is to suggest where we can really go beyond that to do something that will be more broadly applicable.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Are there other questions for Kylie? Do you have anything? Representative Rojas and my wonderful co-chair.
Thank you. No, thank you, Kylie, and thank you to the members of the group for producing this. Just looking at like the DOH website, there are all sorts of reports and plans on there.
Yeah.
And it raises a question: who is responsible? Not who, like, name them, but like how many people are actually doing all of this work already? I mean, you alluded to it that obviously, if we were going to ask for more, we would have to have more resources for DOH. But my sense is that DOH is already short-staffed today.
Yes.
So trying to figure out how many people are
Agree with that.
responsible for actually accomplishing all this work.
It's only a handful of people that, for example, have to oversee the consolidated plan process as I know it. I mean, that would be a better question. DOH would be able to answer more directly the number of staff people that are involved, for example, in the consolidated plan process. In several of the plans that have been produced or come out of the Department of Housing recently, I'm thinking of the one that gave guidance on the municipal housing plans, for example, that RPA was a part of, or the Urban Institute plan were contracted out and other groups were doing those. So the department does, as I know it, use outside partners to produce some of those reports. I think the point is that there were well, a lot of those reports are good. They sort of stand alone, and like a lot of great reports that you read, they're good in their box, and then they kind of go on a shelf. And what our group is saying, well, how do those all relate to one another? You know, how can the municipal housing plans and, for example, the con plan be thought of more as part of a broader planning process and something with more intentionality than these individual plans. So I think each of those individual plans that have been produced are good on their own. Some produced in-house, some again produced by outside partners, but it's really how do they relate to one another and what's the overall goal of our housing planning production. And different plans will tell you sort of different things or provide guidance towards different specific funding streams or different parts of the planning process. And I think what we felt again was this umbrella was what was missing, that there's a lot of the parts, they need to be brought together in a way that's really thoughtful and intentional. And maybe even some of those reports themselves being created with the knowledge that they will be part of this bigger plan.
And the requirements of the federal regulation or requirement, it precludes us from perhaps including state funded programs. Those are all federal programs that they're being asked to report on, and it precludes state
I don't
information.
know that
being
it
included?
precludes, that would be a good question for somebody like Mike Santoro, but it doesn't require them. So
Yeah.
and this is all entered through a HUD regulated system, if you will. So they really just want to know, how are you going to spend these things? What are the tools and information you're using to make your decisions about why you're going to spend this plan this way or this plan that way? It's just restricted to those things. So it's not to say that you couldn't provide more, but it's not what HUD's asking for in that form, if you will. So the consolidated housing plan, again, may not be the ideal vehicle to be the broad planning document, but if it's not, and we're going to do something that's more that is broader, then the consolidated housing plan should align with that broader plan.
And I was only asking because I didn't know if there's an
Yeah.
opportunity to avoid having to have DOH do a whole nother planning
Correct.
process if they're already engaged in this one.
Right.
Is there a way to add to it rather than creating another? Because I know something that we do here in the legislature is ask lots of agencies for lots of plans and reports, and sometimes they're duplicative, sometimes they,
Yep.
or perhaps, I hope many don't sit on a shelf and collect dust, but
Right.
maybe they do. So I was just trying to see if there's a way to reduce that burden rather than add a new one, recognizing that there's probably a need to do what the subcommittee is recommending in terms of
Yeah.
looking at a more comprehensive
I
plan
think-
that takes into account state resources.
Yeah. And I think even if the state does do this broader plan, and again, recognizing where we're asking for additional needs assessment information, that will require additional resources, whether that's staffing inside the department or additional external resources. Many of those 7 elements are things that are going to require more money to dig into, to plan, that sort of thing. But the Department of Housing is still going to have to produce the consolidated plan. That's not going away. I don't think that's still something that HUD will require of us.
And without reading the whole, I forget how many pages it is,
Like
maybe 200,
370.
300 something.
Yeah.
I haven't read it, so and maybe this is a DOH question as well, but what are the performance measures? Do you have a sense of what they look like? What are the outcomes that HUD is looking for? Or are they just looking for outputs? How are we going to spend the money?
Admittedly, it's been a while since I've read the entire thing and since we moved into the writing process. But yes, all of us that read that plan as part of this process identified doing a more in-depth analysis of the performance as something that would be relevant, if not part of the consolidated plan, then a broader plan. So yes, there are specific performance measures that are part of that. But what our group was saying is we think there needs to be more of that, and also apply those performance measures to things outside of just these 5 funding streams. How are we doing on state funding? And I'm sure that DOH is evaluating those in certain ways, but I think what the group felt is it needs to be evaluated against the broader context of where we are as a state in our housing development. Does this align with our goals, both in terms of where we want to build housing and for whom? How are we doing with our existing housing stock? Are we meeting our goals in terms of reaching those folks at the extremely low income, levels with our different streams? All those things, are our intentions with funding matching up with who needs it and that sort of thing. Those are sort of harder and deeper questions beyond just the 5 funding streams that the group felt needs to be in one place and in a more thoughtful way.
Yeah, and it looks like DOH does produce an annual report, and I don't know exactly what that covers, but there's lots of good
Yes.
information there.
Yep.
And I think about it in the context of the debate we're having right now about a shortage of housing. Are we doing anything?
Right.
And I know that DOH is getting a lot of housing built, or getting a
Correct.
lot of funding out the door
Yep.
to get housing built, but I think that's probably getting missed in this larger conversation we're having about the need for more housing.
Yeah, same thing with Chaffo, a lot of unit production. But we also have to look at where we're losing units, right? And so that's another thing this plan says is it's not, we have to be focused on creation, but also preservation of our existing affordable housing stock and sort of our other rental housing stock.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And Anika Lamar, good afternoon.
Hi, it's a pleasure to serve on this committee with Kylie and others. A couple things that I think might echo some of what Kylie has said, but I think might be helpful framing. So just to put a fine point on it, the consolidated plan really is simply a request from HUD asking the state how it plans to spend its money, right? So HUD says, we're going to give you X dollars, and they say, how, Connecticut, do you plan to spend the money? And there's no suggestion or nobody's under any illusions that the money we're getting from the federal government, from HUD, is going to solve all of our problems, right? So there's not an alignment between what the consolidated plan does or what it's intended to do and measuring housing need, because it's simply a statement of how you're going to spend $100. At no point does it allow you to even say, but we need $1 million, right? So I think when our committee initially got together, some of us thought that one approach here was simply to layer on to the consolidated plan other kinds of things that would be helpful to know. And I think, to your point, Representative Rojas, the idea was not to demand that DOH put out 17 different plans, but that maybe there was one truly consolidated plan that could be a possible solution to the puzzle. And the feedback we got from DOH was, that doesn't really work because there's this portal where we insert the consolidated plan for HUD, and there isn't really like a natural box for us to put in like other information. So I think Kylie's right to defer to Mike Santoro on the details of that, but that was my takeaway from his feedback, that he'd prefer to have to do a different thing in addition to the consolidated plan than for us to pretend like the consolidated plan was the right vehicle for more stuff. I think the final framing point I'd put on there is just to say that we really need the more stuff, right? So the state's constantly making decisions about where to spend open space dollars and allocate funding for sewers. And we have towns balancing the need for affordable housing versus other things. And we don't really have a place where we do any of that math. So yes, lots of plans end up rotting away on a shelf. Right now, we don't even have a plan. I'm not entirely sure. Kylie, maybe you could remind the group, the 2010 plan that was created, the statute's still on the books, right? It's not as if the requirement went away. Could you, I guess if I'm going to end with a question, that would be my question.
The state long range housing plan?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I'm not sure if it was required by statute or if it was a document that was produced sort of on its own. I would have to look into that again. I can't recall. But I know it hasn't been produced since 2010 because that's the last version that we looked at.
Yeah, I just couldn't remember if there was an existing requirement that some of our current legislative proposals might get plugged into, but thank you for that.
Thank you. And thanks for all your help with the report and for your student's assistant too in doing some of that best practice review. And there are some specific best practices from other states that are outlined in the footnotes in the report in depth for those of you who want some good bedtime reading. But they are actually pretty valuable in looking at what other states are doing to align reports and incorporate different elements, as Anika noted, the more that we aren't doing here in Connecticut that some other states are.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Kylie. I'll do a last call. Any other questions? I don't see any other hands raised, so just okay. Again, thank you very much, Kylie. And I know the presentation and the full report will get posted on our website and everything for everybody, and greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Moving on the agenda then, under business, legislative, it's just update on House Bill 6647, which was a recommendation from our commission here. I know we have our wonderful P&D co-chairs on, so if they want to add anything on status, but I can tell you on March 8th, they did a joint favorable substitute language of the bill out of committee, and it is on House calendar now, number 88. I believe the change on the JFS language was adding the terminology in of equity, but I'll let either the co-chairs if they want to make any comments on that. So either Representative Kavas-DeGraw or Senator Rahman.
Thank you, Undersecretary Heft. I have no real comment at this time. You're right, that was the language change. And we're hoping to move forward as soon as we possibly can. So looking forward to it.
Terrific. Thank you very much. So we can continue to watch that on the House calendar. Just then moving on, our commission timeline. As we mentioned, we have one more presentation next month, May, for sewage, and then we'll start looking at all of the recommendation reviews during the month of June and complete that by July, and then start working on our draft report and our final recommendations to get a final report due by January 1st of 2024 to meet our statutory deadlines. Our next commission meeting is on May 1st. Is there other business to come up before us or that anyone has before we go to public comment? Okay. Public comment, we did not have anyone sign up for public comment, but is there anyone on has any public comment, whether it be members or guests that have joined us? Okay. It's a quiet bunch today, yes. With that then at 3:45 p.m., I would take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor? Aye.
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 Thank you all, and go UConn.